Hi everyone, this is Matthew Janda for Card Runners, and I'm here with analyzing board textures 10, 23, 12. So this is just going to be another video where we analyze board textures. In these videos, I will randomly generate some flop textures and sometimes turn in river cards as well, and then we're going to discuss what's going on for this board texture. Being able to analyze board textures well incorporates nearly all the theory we've discussed in my other videos. We are not merely restricted to analyzing board textures on the flop and raised pots. We can do 3-bet pots, talk about flop raises, bet sizing, squeeze pots, blind defense, you name it, we can pretty much do anything in these types of videos. We'll discuss ratios and frequencies from other videos, but not get overly concerned with them. That's another thing that's important to notice is in these videos when we talk about ratios, they're usually made from models, so they're not exact, so we can talk about tweaking them a little bit based on the board texture. And the title represents when I started making this video. When I start it, I don't know when I'll finish it or when Card Runners will be able to upload it, but it's just there to give you a sense for when this video was made. These videos don't need to be watched in order, so it doesn't really matter anyways. In this video, we will analyze heads-up and multi-way single-raise pots. Most of the time, we're going to be analyzing heads-up pots just in general in these videos because that's what occurs most often. But enough said, let's go. We're going to do cutoff versus button, and I'll show you the ranges we're going to use. Alright, so I have my little setup going on right now. This is what I often use when I'm actually trying to analyze stuff. I got Flopzilla over here, Poker Stove over here to see the absolute amount of equity for both ranges, then a little notepad in case I need to write anything down for later. So, right here is the cutoff open range. It's a pretty standard cutoff open. It's 26%. If yours is a little different, it doesn't really matter much. But the one thing I really want you to pay attention to now, because it's going to be a big deal, is look at what the offsuit combos are. We have 16 combos of Queen 10. That's a big deal, so if a board hits Queen 10 and we have those offsuit combos, it might be pretty significant. That's true for the cutoff open, but it's especially true for the cutoff versus button flat. Because here, the range is smaller, it's only 13.5%. So a hand like King Queen makes up a really big chunk of this range. So that's something we're going to notice as we go through this video. The other thing you probably want to take note of is these aces and ace kings are weighted at, I believe, 25%. It's good to sort of have some hands that can flop well on king high board textures, so I have them in the button flatting range. They're also good for in case you get squeezed. So anyways, just know they're in the range and then pay a special attention to the offsuit combos. They're a pretty big deal when they hit. Alright, so let's randomly generate our first flop. Alright, so Queen 9-7 rainbow. So there's no real right way to go about analyzing a board texture when you're doing it, but the way I usually like to start, and you're going to see me often do this, is how easy is it to defend checks by check calling when you're out of position? Because if it's a board that's pretty easy to defend by check calling, then it's going to have a pretty big impact on how often your opponent bets the flop, how often you check, how big your opponent's bet sizing is, and all that kind of stuff. So that's a really, really important question to ask, because if you're very aggressively check raising on a board, then your opponent's going to bet differently than if you're, check calling very frequently. So that's the first question that I often ask, and that's an interesting question to ask here. Because this is a board texture where if you're out of position, you probably both don't hate or love giving free cards with a lot of hands. So let's look. So what kind of hands here would make sense to check call? And now really pause for a moment and ask yourself, what kind of hands are you check calling with here? Because if you're one of those players that once he checks, almost always check folds, and I played like that for a long time, you can still win a lot playing that way. It's just not the best way to play as you're trying to get better. But if you are one of those players that plays that way, you're probably going to notice here, you're just not check calling that much stuff. I can easily think of some players that say to themselves, well, I'm going to value bet all my queens because I can get called from weaker hands. I'm also going to bet jacks and tens because I don't want to really give a free card and I can still get value from worse. So I'm pretty much going to bet all that kind of stuff. Then I'm also going to bet sevens just as kind of like a semi-bluff. And then I'm going to bet all my draw. Like they just say that and then they end up betting pretty much every single hand and check fold the rest. Obviously, it's very, very easy for your opponent to exploit you if you're doing that. So think for a moment, what kind of hands would you like to check call here? And if you can't think of any, like for example, if you're like, I don't really like check calling on this board, it's not for me. If that's the case, then you probably should be check raising here more aggressively. Because if you're not going to defend, imagine you're playing against me. I'm on the button, you're in the cutoff. If you're not defending your checks by check calling, then that lets me bet this flop just a ton. And you know what punishes me for betting the flop a ton? You check raising. And that also avoids the problem you might be afraid of, which is I don't really want to check call and give a bunch of free cards. Check raising doesn't. Also keep in mind, when you check raise, usually the hands that your opponent could outdraw you with are gonna semi bluff on the flop. So, for example, you might be like, well, I don't want to check raise pocket sevens. My opponent could hit his gutter. He's going to bet his gutter on the flop. So, if you do have a problem check calling on this board, that's an indicator that you probably should be more check raising more aggressively than you are. Let's put a pin on that check calling idea for one moment and start off with thinking, how strong does a hand need to be to bet on this flop? Now, one thing that's important to remember is if you bet around 75% of the pot on all three streets, your opponent usually ends up needing to defend around 20 to 25% of his range. And that's mostly if your opponent's defending by calling down. So on a board texture like this, you don't want to make the mistake and go, okay, so let's see, if the opponent needs to defend about 20% of his range, whoa, the opponent's only going to felt, his top pair hands. He's going to, so 25%, my opponent might felt all of his top pair and better hands if I bet all three streets. That's not really true, because that would be true if the opponent only called down, but since he's going to raise some of his value hands, he's also going to raise some bluffs. So rather than calling down with queen 10, if you bet all three streets, your opponent might turn queen 10 into a bluff if he's playing optimally, because he's going to need some hands to balance out his pocket nines and pocket sevens, which are going to put in a value raise at some point. So on this flop texture, the opponent's probably raising maybe aces, but probably for sure raising nines, sevens, and 9-7 suited, either on the flop or on a good turn card. So here, when you are thinking about value betting, it's probably really pushing it if you're trying to value bet a hand like queen jack for a big sizing, because your opponent's just never going to call down worse if he's playing well. So it's important to think about stuff like that. The other thing is you can always get into the whole multiple bet sizing thing, and I'm like face palming as I say it because it's just going to be so hard to talk about it in a little bit of time. But if you did want to value bet queen jack here, it's probably going to be in your benefit if you bet smaller with that hand and balance out that range. That's something that's very difficult to do, to balance multiple ranges on the flop. Chances are, to be honest, if you're watching this video, it's probably not something you should be too focused on right now. There's probably bigger fish to fry. But yeah, the whole multiple bet sizing thing, it's pretty much going to be everywhere in post-flop play, and it could be a big deal here. Okay, so going back to check calling. So if we look at this board, it's kind of hard to bet queen jack or queen 10, so those really shouldn't be value bet all three streets. Even king queen's kind of pushing it, because once again, if the opponent's calling down, he's probably not going to call down hands worse than king queen. Ask yourself that question. If you're in a position and you face a bet, how many times, what turn and river cards are usually calling down with queen jack on? Right? Maybe you call down if it's like turn and river that. But on just about any reasonable random turn, I didn't want to do all that. Random turn, random river. I guess I can't just generate the random turn, or I don't know how right at this moment. But on just about any reasonable random turn, random river, you're probably not going to be calling down with queen jack. So back to that same point, it might make sense to check call king queen on this flop, or to consider value betting it, but value bet it smaller. Okay, back to the cutoff open. So we need to be check calling some hands here. Queen jack, queen 10, that stuff seems pretty good. They don't hate giving free cards, yet they're not strong enough to keep value betting, and you need to defend some checks by check calling. What other hands can work well as check calls? Well, probably pocket jacks and pocket 10s. Those are harder to say, because let's imagine one argument without a position pocket 10s here. Someone might say, I like check calling with pocket 10s. I don't really want to bet and get raised. That really sucks. I don't think I can effectively get multiple streets for value, so I'd rather check, let my opponent bluff, and keep his range wide. That sounds like a pretty reasonable argument. Someone else might also say, I really like to bet with pocket 10s on this board. Because when I bet with pocket 10s, I might make my opponent fold a high equity hand. Like maybe I can get my opponent to fold ace jack on the flop, which is awesome. And if I do bet, my opponent will usually call with like a 9, maybe even pocket 8 or a 7x hand, so I get value from those hands, and then he'll likely check back like a 9x hand on the turn of the river, and I'll win at showdown. Also a reasonable argument. Those are both extremely reasonable arguments for betting the flop with 10s, and then reevaluating the turn likely to check call, or checking the flop with 10s to defend more checks and to keep your opponent's range wide. I do not know what the correct answer is here. So if someone's like, well, in theory, what's the correct one? I don't know. Wouldn't surprise me at all if in theory you're supposed to do each some fraction of the time. It's called a mixed strategy. So I don't know. I'm just taking a note of it when I'm playing this hand. Hey, if I have pocket 10s, probably a good hand for me to actually pause, look at my opponent's stats, even if I'm playing 9 tables. It's worth it here because betting and checking are different enough lines and it's close enough here that even if I'm busy with a lot of other stuff, I probably want to look at it real quick, look at my opponent's stats. So probably check calling queen jack, queen 10, pocket jacks. You can go either way with probably betting or check calling king queen or pocket 10s. Same with some ace 9, king 9 hands. Same deal as the whole pocket 10s thing. But the cool thing to note is if you have like ace 9 and your opponent has ace jack, if you check a call, an ace is tainted on the turn, and you're like, haha, gotcha. So maybe you want to check call ace 9 and bet 10s. Who knows? Important stuff to think about when you're actually figuring out how you want to approach the flop. So, we don't have a ton of hands that want to check a call here. It's not the easiest board to check a call. Not the most difficult either, but it's not the easiest board to check a call. So if you actually start writing down combos, you're probably going to see that if you're not check raising out of position with hands like pocket 7s or pocket 9s, you're going to get destroyed here by your opponent's betting range. Because he just can't defend enough checks. Think about it. If we're cutoffers button, and I'm in the cutoff, and I check to you, and I'm not check raising this board, what hands are you checking back? Because even your marginal hands are going to be like, if you have king 9, or you wouldn't have king 9, let's say you have ace 9 suited. The thing that makes you kind of reluctant to bet in position with ace 9 suited is you're like, I really don't want to bet and get check raised. If my opponent has 10s or jacks and I just value bet myself once, it doesn't really matter, I can still outdraw him, but getting check raised here sucks. Well, if I'm in the cutoff and I'm not check raising you here, you don't really, even your medium strength hands aren't really going to want to check back. So, hands like pocket 9s or pocket 7s probably can get check raised. Sort of the easy value betting hands here are like ace, queen, aces, kings. And then, we've already mentioned a bunch of the other stuff. So now let's look in position. So in position, if we're facing a bet, this is probably the stuff I've talked about the most on Card Runner, so people are probably pretty comfortable with it. Which is, if you're facing a bet, you kind of just count your value raises, you can double it, and then that's a good amount of bluff raises. As a general rule of thumb on most board textures, it's still a model. So here, when we're in position, the hands that are strong enough to raise on this flop are probably this stuff right, yeah? And that's going to be like 9s, 9-7 suited, pocket 7s, and probably aces as well. So, these hands, if we raised all 8 and never slow played, we'd be able to bluff raise here decently often, and that also ties back to why it's actually close for whether or not you bet hands like king, queen, or 10s on the flop, because a good opponent's going to raise you aggressively here. And it sucks when you have king, queen, or 10s and get raised. So, these hands can get raised, and you can raise a good amount of bluffs. As I said, I assume most of you watching this know the drill, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but look for 3 to a flush, look for 3 to a straight, look for gut shots that don't want to call. All that kind of stuff works pretty well. And you're going to want to call with most of your medium strength hands. Pretty much top pair hands are just going to get called. Ace queen has some nice qualities about raising it, but if your opponent's not barreling like a madman when you raise ace queen in position, there's going to be a lot of tricky stuff on the turn in the river. All the stuff we talk about is almost always like the cliff noted version. Stuff is much more complex than this, and when I mention stuff that's close, I'm intentionally mentioning stuff that I think is close, and so kind of by the nature of that, there's not usually a clear answer. So here, if I'm facing a bet, I'm probably calling with ace queen, probably calling with king queen and queen, king queen and queen jack are pretty much never going to get raised. I'm going to call with most of my draws. If you wanted to raise a little bit of them, that actually helps balance out the range. In practice, raising with draws is a little bit trickier because I think people 3-bet a little too much. But in theory, if I'm raising a range of sets in air, sprinkling in a draw or two, nothing wrong with it. So yeah, pretty normal for defending in position, not all that hard. If the opponent checks, if he's one of those players that just doesn't defend his checks, I would bet my entire range here. I don't want to give a free card with my marginal strength hands. A lot of my marginal strength hands, like 9x and 7x, still retain equity against better hands. And then if I have a small pocket pair, I'll just bluff with it. So if my opponent's not really check raising here, I'm going to probably bet my entire range. But against a good opponent, you're going to check back a lot of the medium strength stuff. So I think that pretty much wraps up this board. You could keep talking about it in more and more detail, but I think that's good enough, so let's just boom! Alright, so Jack with the 8 of diamonds. Alright, so this board texture is a really tricky one for a few reasons, and I'm just going to mention it briefly now. We're still going to start off for the most part doing the what can we check a call with thing here, but the removal effects here are a really big deal. So it's kind of like one of those things where if I have a jack, it's kind of hard to get value because my opponent can't really have many weaker hands. Whereas if I'm bluffing, my opponent can have more of his jacks. So it's a tricky board texture when you start trying to take into account removal effects. Okay, so anyways, that's just something to take note of. So here, what kind of hands start off the same thing? How easy is this board texture to check a call? What kind of hands make sense to check call? Well, let's start off with seeing if we bet the cutoff, in the cutoff all 3 streets, how wide our opponent needs to call down. So go right here. Okay, so he has 3 of a kind, 12.3%. Again, though, he's not just going to call down with, the top 20 or 25%. He's going to end up raising them. So, for this 21% here, it might be tempting to think, okay, I just looked at the numbers, and Matt said in some video somewhere that he calls down top 20. No, that's if he only defends by calling. So here, if he has 10s and 9s, they're probably not going to felt on almost any turn and river card. And think about it for a second. If you're in the button and I bet here against you 3 times, how many board textures are you calling down with if the, with pocket 10s or pocket 9s? If you don't bink up full house or like a runner, flush or straight, probably almost none. So here, it's tricky to tell what to do with what types of hands when you're out of position. I think this is just a board texture where you wouldn't bet all that aggressively with hands like aces, kings, and queens and stuff like that. Because when you have hands like aces, kings, and queens, and don't get me wrong, I would bet them against a lot of people in practice, but you want to be careful about giving a free card. So another thing to keep in mind is that, like, you might want to bet with a hand like aces without a diamond, because you're a little bit more afraid of getting runner flushed. With, turn and river both diamond. But if you had aces with a diamond, you'd be less afraid of turn diamond, river diamond. So here with a hand like aces, kings, and queens, you definitely, I think, can go either way when you're out of position, and it might become a bet sizing question. So here, if we find out, for example, like, ooh, you know what? If we bet that big, our opponent doesn't need to call down 10s and 9s, well, maybe we're betting too big. Maybe we should be betting smaller with our overpairs, and that gets our opponent to call down with 10s and 9s. And then you have this whole little mini problem on this board texture for figuring out how big you want to bet with overpairs. So yeah, you can probably go either way with overpairs. Jacks, you're probably, when you're out of position or when you're in position, you probably want to, again, you want to do a mixture of both things with those types of hands. If you never check call overpairs and you never check call jacks when you're out of position here, how much incentive does your opponent really have to ever check back the flop? Probably almost none. But likewise, if you don't bet any of your jacks when you're out of position here, maybe your opponent's just going to bet almost never because you have too many jacks and you're check raising too aggressively. So this is a board texture where you can probably already tell I'm not sure exactly what to do. So there's further steps you can take into account. So the first thing would be is let's just look at how much of the really good hands are in each player's range. So the cutoff, what are you flossing here? You're flossing 11.4%, 3 of a kind. How about button flat? 12.3. So button's got to beat a little bit on the trips, but then the cutoff comes in and is like, no, I've got more overpairs. So the ranges look like they both can have around the same amount of really strong hands. So that doesn't help us all that much. So it's still tricky. So then the next thing I do is I take this range right, and then I put it right, So this will be the cutoff open range, and then I take the button flatting range. Come on. Right, and then put it over, So then once I have that, and just so we know, like overall, they both have around 50% equity preflop. But now I can plug in the board texture and be like, how did this board texture change the equity? Boop. Not all that much. So, it's still tough. Because a lot of times what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to take, when you look at Flopzilla, you'll be able to see one range has a lot more equity. One range has a lot more of the really strong hands than the other range. So that should usually be the betting range. That makes sense all the time because if, you can't bet if you don't have any really good hands for the most part. But if it looks close, then you say, okay, that still didn't help me a lot. So then you can look at the overall equity of both players' ranges. And if, for example, if I saw that the cutoff only had 44% equity, whereas the button had 56% equity, and hey, maybe that would have happened. Actually, I should adjust one thing. Let's take out the aces and the ace-king because we want it weighted. So it's almost, doesn't change that much, but it's 50-50. But like, let's imagine that the player in position called with king-jack off and queen-jack off. Then it's like a pretty substantial jump in equity, and then also here you'd see a much bigger jump. Did this discount effect go down? Oh no, it's still there. Okay, so we don't know exactly what to do here yet. For the most part, since the ranges look about equally strong and the player in position has a decent advantage, being in position is not incredibly valuable on this board texture, but it is still pretty valuable. I would just think that the out of position player shouldn't be betting here all that often. Still going to need to bet sometimes, but he's going to need to defend his checks pretty aggressively by check calling and check raising, because if he just bets his good hands out of position, his checking range is way too vulnerable, and then the player in position won't want to give a bunch of free cards and will bet. So, a good example of a spot where you're probably going to have to both bet some jacks and check raise some jacks and check call some jacks when you're out of position here, because if you always do one of those three, it's going to be pretty easy for your opponent to exploit you if he knew what he was doing. So, very interesting board texture, one that's particularly hard to analyze, but hopefully you still picked up a few things. So let's randomly generate another one. Alright, so let's start off with pausing if you want and asking yourself that question. If I'm playing here, what hands am I usually check calling with if I'm the cutoff against a button? Imagine you're playing against a reg or an unknown. Maybe a reg's a little better, because against an unknown you just probably have general exploitative tendencies you'll use. But against a reg, what hands are you check calling with here? I'm guessing the vast majority of people are going to answer close to nothing because they're going to say, hey, I'd rather just kind of bet my 9s or my 8s because if I do, I make my opponent fold some overcards and then I can just check call on the turn if the turn card's good and I don't really want to check call the flop when there's so many cards, blah, blah, blah. They probably also do the same thing with 10s. So just another spot where it's probably really showcasing how most people don't know how to defend checks. Okay, so let's analyze the overall the overall strength of both ranges to start off. So going a little bit out of order here. So this range, the cutoff opening range has a set 3% and an overpair 10%, and the cutoff and the button flat has a set 5.5% and an overpair 6.5%. So in terms of like the premium hands, it's hard to say which range is better. Cutoff and the button are usually both pretty close, by the way, so this isn't unusual that we're finding a lot that are close. But, you know, the cutoff has more really good overpairs, whereas the button has more sets. So it's pretty much the way it is, and it's who knows which range is actually overall better there. We can plug in the overall equity, though, which is going to be probably pretty useful here. But it still, once again, is probably going to give us a very similar amount. Okay, so this one, it looks like overall for which range got more equity, it hit the cutoff range a little bit better. Because on a random board, so this is 53.47, whereas on a random board texture, it was 51.49. So it hit the cutoff opening range a little bit better in terms of absolute equity. And then once again, we would need to add in the fractions of the aces and the ace-king here, but it shouldn't change it much. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's start. What kind of hands are going to be able to bet all three streets for value? So cutoff versus button. Top pair is 17.6%. So that's actually really convenient. It looks like the the button is going to have to defend at worst his top pair hands. Because remember, he's going to raise at some point with pocket 10s, pocket 5s, pocket 3s, a whole bunch of air, and probably pocket aces. So even expecting the opponent to call down with like 10-8, 10-9, Jack 10, that's pushing it. Even Queen 10 is probably pushing it because he's going to raise at some point, or the turn of the river is going to put some better hands in his range. Okay, so that's a useful starting point. So now let's go back to the cutoff range and ask ourselves, okay, if our opponent's not really calling down, if we bet all three streets with a hand like, you know, if our opponent's not calling down with like a Queen 10, Queen 10, Jack 10, 10, 9, do we really want to bet those sort of marginal 10s in our range? Maybe. I mean, I really doubt betting all three streets for 70% of the pot is going to be good here. So you could probably do some bet sizing stuff if you wanted to, but for the most part, you're not going to want to bet at least the flop and the turn. I would say very big with those kind of hands. If you have a hand like King 10 or Queen 10 or Jack 10, if you are betting the flop, and betting the flop isn't that much different from checking, so that's another really tricky little thing. Like, let's imagine the pot's $30 on the flop. If you bet $4 or if you check and you're out of position, it does almost no difference, right? I mean, you didn't reopen up the betting. Betting $4 is practically a check. You probably actually treat Fish's min bet as like a check when you're playing against it, and there really is almost no difference. So if you did have a hand like a Queen 10 or Jack 10 on this flop and wanted to bet it, you probably should be betting pretty small. But for the most part, I would say you gotta check call something, because if you're never check calling something, it's going to cause a ton of problems for your range. So I think the kind of hands that make the most sense to sort of check call in this board texture are going to be hands like Queen 10 and Jack 10. And the other thing that's important to keep in mind is when we are out of position here, we have like 20 combos of Queen 10 and Jack 10, which is pretty nice. That's a good amount. We hit some off-suit stuff. King 10 could also be check called, which would give us a lot more 10s that are check calling with and sort of beef up our check calling range a little bit. Likewise, you could check call with pocket 9s or pocket 8s on this flop texture, but pause for a moment and ask yourself, what's the problem? And the answer you probably thought of is it gives your opponent free cards, which is very risky here. When you bet 9s or 8s and you make your opponent fold over cards, that's pretty awesome. I've honestly paused and deleted recordings from not expressing stuff clearly enough times now that I'm not sure exactly what I've explained, but even if I have explained this, I'm going to do it one more time. Imagine that you are talking with someone who's out of position in the cutoff here, and he tells you this. He tells you, I like betting 9s when I'm in the cutoff here on this board texture, because when I bet 9s, I can get my opponent to call with hands like pocket 8s, pocket 7s, pocket 6s, or a 5x hand, and then he's usually going to check down on the turn in the river and I'll win on showdown. In addition, if I bet 9s and I make my opponent fold like King Jack off or Ace Jack off or something like that, that's pretty useful because those hands have like 28 or 29% equity. So I like betting 9s because it gets value from worse and makes high equity hands fold. Pretty reasonable argument. Whereas if someone else told you, I don't really like betting with pocket 9s here, because if I bet with pocket 9s, it's going to suck really, really badly if I get raised, and I make my opponent's range stronger, and then I'm not really going to know what to do on the turn once I check. Also a reasonable argument. That argument I think would be a little bit stronger for on like a 10-6-5 board, because here if you bet pocket nines, you're going to get raised more often, whereas on the 10-5-3 board, people probably don't want to raise in position, which we'll talk about in a minute. But on this board, you're probably going to get raised more often. So in that case, it's like, yeah, betting nines, yeah, it's nice not to give free cards, but then you get raised. It's gross. The whole reason why I'm talking about this isn't to tell you that I know the correct answer for whether or not to bet nines here, just that it is tough. In reality, I probably would bet it because I don't think you're going to get raised on this board texture very much. And I also think the cutoff's range is a little bit stronger than the button's range. And I think I really hate giving free cards, whereas in reality, if you bet, you probably can get your opponent to fold some, like, at least king-jack off. So when you take all that into account, I think I would be on the betting nines camp. And once again, it's hard to check call a lot of hands here because we don't like giving free cards. So hands I could check call here. We could check call some, like, really strong hands to be tricky, like some pocket aces. We could check call some queen 10, jack 10, king 10. We could check call, we'd have to actually check call some air here. Oh, I almost forgot it. This would have been a big mistake on my part. Ace-king actually works pretty well as a check call here. Pause for a moment, or don't pause it, but like, think about it. It sounds weird, but like, think about it. Ace-king doesn't really hate giving a free card because it can outdraw the opponent all the time. It's gonna not be able to utilize its showdown value very well if you bet the flop because you make your opponent's range a lot stronger. And if you check call with ace-king and the turn card comes a king or an ace, your opponent's probably gonna barrel it. So check calling ace-king, I almost forgot it for some reason, but like that was something that I remember I sort of learned when I was playing around with this stuff at first, which is, hey, you know, if I don't check call ace-king, it's really hard to check call here. And ace-king actually does some nice stuff for the range. So, cool. Something else to think about. The other thing to think about is if we're not check calling a whole ton of hands, we probably want to check raise some hands here. So, what are the obvious hands to check raise here? As will usually be the correct answer to, you know, check raise some pocket threes and some air. Okay. So, let's look a little bit more in position now. That was a bit of a ramble, but that's kind of how you have to bang it out, I guess. So, in position, if we're facing a bet, same typical deal. Here, I would rather slow play all the strong hands. Pocket threes, pocket fives, pocket tens, none of them are afraid of pretty much anything on the turn. So, even though it's going to make you have to float the flop really wide, and it will, that's an easy mistake to make, is to think, wait a second, I'm used to, you know, bluff raising my gut shots and my 3 to flush 3 to straight, but if I'm not raising on this board, I need to fold them. No, you probably have to float them. So a hand like 9-8 of spades, I'm not folding that when I'm facing a bet here. I can do a lot of fun stuff on a 9 turn, an 8 turn, a 7 turn, or a jack turn, or a spade turn. That's like probably over half the deck. So you have to float a lot because you're not raising this board texture, and then you wait until the turn. Your opponent's going to hate his life. Like if you float on this board texture and the turn card comes to 6 of spades on the turn, you can just call again with 9-8 of spades. Whereas if your opponent bet 9-8 of spades on this board and you called, and then he bets the turn and you raise, your opponent hates life. So it's very useful to call very wide on this board texture, and then you can play the turn when when the turn card board gets like wetter, it adds more sort of texture to the board. Then you can start having a raising range, and it's very effective when you're in position. So yeah, mostly just call here, call wide, so don't make that mistake of folding too much. And then a lot of times you're just going to call, turn's going to come like a whatever, a 2, and then you have 9-8 of diamonds and you bet and your opponent folds. So call that stuff, call your really strong hands. Be sure to float with the hands that your opponent will keep barreling with. So ace, queen, and stuff is obviously going to be a very easy float. But yeah, very easy to play this board in position. The out of position is the much more interesting one. So out of position, make sure you're check calling enough. Try to balance that range if you can a little bit with some sort of airish, you know, ace X hands, and then to balance out your medium strength hands. Then you can also check raise as well to defend more combos. Alright, so boom. 8-4-3. Okay, so another interesting one to talk about. It's pretty similar to the last one, but still decently different. So, like, actually, I want to start off with doing this right here. Let's do the 8 of hearts, just for the nits at home that don't want me to switch suits. So the 8, alright, so let's go there. Alright, so that actually didn't change the equity of the range all that much. Sometimes you'll get a more drastic effect when you go from like a 10 to an 8 when you're comparing like a big blind flatting range to a button opening range, but you don't really get that effect here, I guess. So no big deal. So we're going to just start off doing the same thing that I always do, which is how would you check a call here? If you're cut off and you open in the button flats, what are you usually check calling with on this board texture? I'm guessing just about everyone would say nothing, and we'll get to that in a minute. So, alright, comparing the ranges. They both have about the same amount of equity. This range has 14% overpair but 3% set, and good overpairs. This range has 14% overpairs but weaker quality overpairs, and 5.5% set. Again, the ranges are pretty close. Let's see. Top pair doesn't really matter all that much here. Top pair 23%. Top pair 21%. So again, very, very similar with the ranges. So one thing we haven't been talking about directly as much as probably we should have been is how valuable is position. So one thing you're usually going to notice is the board textures that are hard to check call are usually the board textures where being in position helps a lot. Nothing shocking there. So here, since it's going to be really hard to check a call, position is going to be pretty favored. So when you get this board texture, chances are your opponent, or if you're in the cutoff and your opponent's in the button, he's probably in a better position than you because you have around the same amount of equity, around the same sort of hand quality. Cutoff's hand quality is probably actually a little bit better since it has better overcards and better overpairs, but being in position is a big deal here. And that's something the button has. So here, if we have a hard time check calling, how do we make it so that we're not just check folding all the time when we check? Check raise very, very aggressively. So I don't know exactly where you want to draw the line, but if you're having a really hard time defending checks here, maybe you should be check raising with not only pocket fours, pocket threes, and pocket eights, but also maybe even pocket aces. Now you've got a really check raising range. You can get nitty about, what overpair to check raise and whether or not you want to have the club. Not something we need to go into right now. Another thing to notice is I also said check raise the eights. Having an 8 here isn't that big of a deal for a removal effect. If someone was going to check raise pocket kings on this board, I would hate it. Because it's like, dude, why are you check raising? You're removing like 2/3 of the good hands you can have. Whereas here, if we're check raising, a lot of our value isn't coming from our opponent's 8s anyways, so it's more acceptable to check raise 8s here. Okay, so on this board texture, make sure you're check raising aggressively, but we still would need to develop some sort of check calling range. That's hard to do, and I would really just avoid it if you can kind of get away with avoiding it. So in practice, I'm not going to check call here against most people. I'm just going to check raise. But in theory, what happens if I never check call and I only check raise or check fold? Then that will let you do some gross stuff to me with your bet sizing. You can bet very small, knowing I'm not really going to check call, and that forces me to develop a range and all this other not fun stuff for me. So here, what you probably should be check calling with, I would guess in theory, is you can check call with some like pocket nines, 9x type of hands. You could probably even check a call with like, you're allowed to check call with like flush draws and stuff too. You don't want to always bet flush draws. You can check call with some overcards, like ace king can work very well as a check call here, just like it did on the last board texture. If you're playing against an unknown, just to be super clear, I would just bet ace king. But in theory, do you need to check call some? Yeah, I'd be surprised if you don't, because you need to have some check calling range. But the cliff notes to take from this is on a board texture where you have a hard time check calling, make sure you're check raising very aggressively. That might even require you to check raise some overpairs. Because at the end of the day, if your opponent's going to like almost always bet here when you check to him, and also ask yourself, if some unknownish reg checks to you and you're in the button versus cutoff, what hands are you checking back on the button? Pause for a moment and think if you want to, but I'm guessing the answer is pretty much nothing. Because you're going to say to yourself, I don't want to give a free card, but I also don't want to, you don't want to give a free card, and why am I drawing a blank here? I'm in too deep to erase this, guys. I usually edit this stuff out, but yeah, you're going to say to yourself, if you have a really strong hand, you're going to want to bet for value, and if you have a really weak hand, you're going to want to just bluff it, because bluffing is going to be profitable, and then if you have a medium strength hand, you would want to bet it somewhat for value and somewhat for protection. Like, for example, if you have 8-9 here, you're like, even if I don't get a lot of value, I don't like just handing out free cards. Yeah, so I usually edit that stuff out, but in my head, that's what I was trying to set up, because I knew there were like 3 different types of hands you could have: strong hands, medium hands, and weak hands. And against an unknown, you're going to want to bet all of those. And then I just started talking and forgot it. So anyways, yeah, you're probably not checking back many hands here. So if you're not checking back many hands here, it's going to make check raising really, really effective for your opponent. So when you start noticing this stuff because you analyze board textures, you might think to yourself, well, if I'm in the cutoff, though, I don't really like check raising kings or aces because that makes my opponent's range really, really, really strong. But then if you go look over here, you go, well, wait a second. Come on. Wait a second. He only has 2 pair or better 5.5% of the time. And honestly, if I check kings, I think most people are betting almost 100% of their range on the flop. So think about that kind of stuff. So, yeah. This board texture, I mean, that's the most important stuff by far we've already kind of discussed. And then as you start trying to play this closer to like theoretically correct, it's very, very, very difficult. But it's also one of those things where the more theoretically correct way to play it probably isn't the more effective way to play it against most players anyways. Some of the stuff that we talked about is, so if you're not check raising here, start check raising. But if you are in position and some unknown checks to you, I wouldn't check anything back here either. Okay, so let's do one more real quick. All right, last one for these. I don't know, I hit clear. Boom. Jack of hearts, 8 of diamonds, 5 of clubs. So already when I see a board like this, like the first thing that kind of pops into my head after I've done a lot is like, this seems kind of like it's in the middle. Like we already saw like at least we've seen in other videos, if not in this one, we've seen some like really, really dry boards. Whereas we've seen some really, really wet boards in this video. Whereas on this one, it's like, it's kind of in the middle. Like the first thing you want to notice is like every suited connector or gapper pretty much has a lot going on this board texture. You can't have a suited connector or suited gapper that's not a pair or some sort of draw. Pretty big deal here. They'll also usually be through to a flush as well. So a lot of interesting things to do since it's in between a wet board and a dry board, I would say. Okay, so here if I say, hey, what hands can you guys check call with when you're out of position? Since it's in between a wet and a dry board, you probably have less trouble check calling here. You're probably going to be like, I can check call with like Queen Jack or Queen King. There's not a lot of overcards I'm really afraid of. I can check call with Jack 10 as well. I could also maybe make a smaller bet and do some fun stuff like that. But here it's not as hard to check call with those types of hands. So the most obvious hand to check call with here, I would say, is Queen Jack. But in theory, you're not going to want to make normal bet sizes on all 3 streets with King Jack here. We can go look real quick. So let's look. Top pair, 20%. So our opponent's going to have to call down probably this stuff. Like, this is the absolute worst he'd ever call down with. He's not even going to end up calling down with Jack 9 or Queen Jack usually. So it depends on how much you hate giving a free card, but personally, if I had Jack 10 or Jack 9 and I'm out of position, I'm just going to risk giving a free card here because I want to be able to defend some of my checks. And this isn't a board texture where it's awesome to check raise really aggressively. So I would probably be like, on this board texture, I'm going to check call King Jack, Queen Jack, Jack 10, Jack 9, and then maybe I'll value bet 10s and 9s because I care more about denying free cards with those hands. That sounds weird, but let's talk about that for one quick second. It can make sense to value bet 9s here for a single street of value, but not value bet Queen Jack. Because 9s, they hate giving free cards. You know, a 9 doesn't want an ace, a king, a queen, or a 10 to turn. Whereas Queen Jack it only really minds a king or an ace turning. So since there's twice as many cards a 9 hates seen on the turn as Queen Jack hates, that often means I'm going to bet the weaker hand for a single street of value and then check the one that's less afraid of giving free cards. So it's very convoluted for exactly where you draw these lines, but that's something that you want to think about, which is when you're kind of designing a range that's going to be betting for a single street for value, think about it. There's usually going to have hands that hate giving a free street. I'm not in love with giving a free street with Jack 10 or Jack 9, but I'll deal with it. And then a hand like pocket, or a hand like 8x or 5x, those often can work pretty well as... Actually, let's pause there. Think for a second. What can a hand like 5x work pretty well with here if you're out of position? Or what can a hand like 8x work pretty well with here if you're out of position? It's tricky, but it's a check raise. And that doesn't mean you need to check raise all of them. It's just something that can work pretty well. Because maybe you check a hand like 8x and then it checks back. Then you can have the hand that can win at showdown if your opponent doesn't bet. For example, maybe your opponent will just check down with pocket 7s and you'll win. So 8x can be good for that, and then if your opponent bets, you can check raise a hand like 8-7 of clubs, and it actually retains its equity pretty well. Think about what kind of turn cards you can barrel on if you have 8-7 of clubs. You can barrel an 8, or a 7, or a 6, or a 9, or a club. That's a lot, and 8-7, once again, can do pretty well if it checks through. So you can get tricky with those types of hands. Again, this isn't a video where it's meant that we map out every single hand. That takes a long time, and that's less of the point here. More of the point is just understanding the board texture. So here, since it's in the middle of wetness, you're usually going to be able to check call some and check raise some pretty comfortably. Okay, so I think we got that out of the way. So let's just look at the cutoffs range in position. Same deal. It's sort of in the middle of wetness. So here, if someone were to ask me, hey Matt, what do I do with 8s or 5s when I face a bet in position? It looks close. I mean, you can do either one. So look at your opponent's stats and see which one you want to do against him particularly. This is a huge deal, which people miss a lot, though, is when you are raising here, as you probably will sometimes, bluff raise with hands that retain their equity against a very strong hand. So if someone shows me a hand where they bluff raise ace-queen here, I just absolutely hate it because I'm like, dude, when you raise ace-queen, you make your opponent fold hands that he was going to double barrel on the turn for value that you beat. So, for example, if you have ace-queen in position and the opponent was betting king-queen on the flop, If you call and turn a queen, it's like fist pump gotcha, because he's going to keep betting and you're going to keep getting value from a weaker hand. Whereas if you raise ace-queen on this board texture, you're going to make all the hands you dominate fold, and then you're going to, if the turn card comes an ace or a queen, you're going to be like, oh, I don't really know what to do. Because if the turn card's a queen, I don't want to just lose to queen, jack, and over pairs, but you know, it's tough. So don't raise a hand like ace-queen, raise a more robust hand. Raise a gut shot. Let me see if we got a good one here. Give me 1 second to think. This one's kind of tricky because it's all the double gutters have. So usually, ideally, you will have like 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight, which will be the best example. Because 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight, it's like, well, then I can just comfortably double barrel the turn of the river, and I know my equity is so robust that when I do hit the flush or the straight on the river, I don't care how strong my opponent's range is because I'm pretty much winning. Another good example here might be like 5-4 suited. You could raise this in position with like 5-4 of diamonds, because then you're going to be like, I'll just double barrel a 6 or a 5 or a 4 or a 3 or a diamond. All that equity is really, really robust, because if I do hit it, it's just boom, even if my opponent's range is strong. Where if I have ace-queen, it's harder to keep getting value. So now for the last 15 or 20 minutes, I want to talk about multi-way pots. So imagine that not only the button called, but the big blind called as well. And we're not going to go over the big blind's range. It's not that big a deal. But what I want to really do is talk about how board textures sort of change based on whether or not they're multi-way. How our hand strength is relative to how many players are in the pot. So we're going to do that for a little bit. And then what we learn from that not only will help us a ton in multi-way pots, but it will still be useful when talking about single raise pots. So let's go ahead and go for a random right here. Alright, so queen 10-6. So one thing that's very important about multi-way pots is when you're betting, you want your hands to retain equity against strong ranges. So for example, if you're betting ace-king and your head's up here, an ace or a king on the turn is probably going to be good, because you're only against one opponent who probably called on the flop pretty wide, so you're going to be good pretty often when you turn an ace or a king. Whereas if you bet, and you might even still be able to keep getting value on that ace or the king turn if you keep betting. Whereas if you bet on the flop and there's 4 players left to act, and one of them calls and the turn card comes a king or an ace, it's going to be really, really hard to keep getting value, because people only had to defend a much stronger hands on the flop. So that's the first thing you kind of want to notice on this board texture, is if you are bluffing, you want to make sure your overcards are going to either have some sort of draw component, like ace-king still has the gutter here, or are going to be able to, or you're not relying on that one component, like you're not just relying on your overcards as the bluff component. So like here you have a gutter. So if this were the flop instead, for example, I'm going to cheat. I would like betting with ace-king a lot less here, unless you had like the ace of diamonds, because it's like, if you turn the ace or the king, it's going to be really hard to keep getting value, because so much of your opponent's range is going to be, you know, king, queen, or ace, queen that has 2 pair. And even if you haven't beat, you're just not going to keep getting value. Alright. So I think it was this or this. It doesn't matter. Okay. So when you are multi-way out of position here, the problem is much more complex. Like, so you care less about defending your checks and stuff when you're out of position multi-way, because there's someone else that can help defend or someone else that can bet. But here, if I were out of position, I'm probably not going to be betting king-queen multi-way, because it's just not a strong enough hand to bet multiple streets with. It will let me defend some of my checks by check calling, and I also hate getting raised here. And if I have 2 opponents that are raising pretty much awesome draws, pocket 10s, pocket 6s, and air, if they're really good aggressive opponents that can raise that, they might even raise queen 10 too, then it's just like, I'm going to get raised with king-queen all the time. I'm going to hate that. I'd rather check king-queen on the flop. And now keep in mind, if I check king-queen on the flop, I'm not like, oh man, I'm slow playing, I hope you bet, I'm going to get you so hard if you bet. That's not how I'm thinking at all if I check king-queen. What I'm thinking with king-queen is like, I really hope they check around, because then king-queen's probably the best hand, and then I can get the 1 or 2 streets of value comfortably with this hand that I like to get. Because if I check and I face a bet, then it's like, ugh, I mean, I still have to check a call, most likely, but it's hard for my opponent to be value betting much worse. Maybe he is. Maybe he's going 1 street with like a hand like queen jack, and then he's going to check down the turn in the river, but it's hard for him to be betting much worse. So totally okay to check a hand like king queen here and be like, please check back, please check back, please check back. You can bet the strong draws. You can do the same sort of deal with check raises. So you can check raise your sets on this board texture or bet them. They both work decently well. But, you know, if you want to make sure you're defending enough of your checks here, you can check raise, you know, 6s and 10s, and then instead just value bet like aces and kings. Totally fine, pretty standard here. In reality, look at your opponent's stats and see if you think check raising or betting will be better. When you're in position here, it's pretty easy to know how to face a bet. We don't really need to talk about that all that much. So, the difference between this board texture when you're in position and out of position is make sure you're understanding how when you hit an overcard, it's going to change what you can and can't do. You probably can't keep getting values when you hit an overcard. Likewise, if you were going to try to go for a somewhat finished value with king, queen heads up here, you probably cannot do that multi-way. It's just not going to give you multiple streets here, and you're going to risk getting raised too much. That's especially true if you were trying to get value with queen jack. Alright, so let's go random again. So this board's not really a new one. We've done this example several times in different videos. So, as was the case before, you're gonna have to really defend your checks by check raising here. There's two other people at least when you're multi-way. So, you don't have to worry as much about defending your checks because your opponent has to, know that you're both not check calling, you're not check calling and your opponent's not check calling. But it is a board texture where it's very, very hard to check a call, both for you and likely your opponent too. So, because of that, you're going to have to check raise more aggressively here. Sets are still probably going to be strong enough to check raise. Value betting here is going to be more difficult to do. So let's think about this for a second. For out of position multi-way, the hands that are going to likely want to be value bet here are going to be what? Probably overpairs. But if we bet overpairs before, the sizing heads up might not work that well multi-way. Because heads up, we might have been able to be like, oh, our opponent has to call down this wide, so we're going to use this, our opponent has to call down this wide, we're going to use this sizing, win a big pot, and then go high-five our friends. But when you're multi-way, there are twice as many people that can have sets and raise you. And remember, when you're betting queens here and get raised, that completely sucks if your opponent's good. So there's twice as many opponents that can raise you. They both probably have all of their set combos. They can add that right ratio of air to that and draws to that really strong raising component. So you might want to bet a little smaller on the flop because you go, well, if I bet smaller, it makes my opponent call down wider, which is kind of what I need because he has to, he can call down much stronger hands since there's two players. And when I get raised, it sucks less to have bet $10 into a $20 pot and gotten raised than if you bet $15 into a $20 pot. So here, you might find your range won't play all that differently, but your bet sizing will be different on a spot like this because you want to make sure your opponent can call with worse hands and you want to lose less money when your opponents have sets. This would probably be a board texture that would be very, very interesting to analyze on the turn and the river, and that's when you get into a lot of fancy stuff. But I don't want to do a multi-way board on the turn or the river. It's just going to get too complex without having everything already written down. So just kind of be aware of that, though. You don't often when I'm talking about stuff in videos, I'll be like, you can use a smaller sizing. You're going to have to adjust that sizing on the turn and the river. So, for example, here, if you bet small on the flop and your opponent called, and let's say you bet small with pocket kings, and the turn card came a 3 of spades, you might not want to bet small again. You might be like, oh, awesome. My opponent probably didn't slow play a strong hand on the flop, so I can make a big bet here, and it's very, very difficult for him to do anything because I got an amazing turn card. So just keep that in mind. That when I do say, you can bet bigger, you can bet small, you're going to have to change that based on what the turn card is. I know that's pretty obvious, but it is something that's just important to always remember. Alrighty. Oh, okay, so this one's fun. So, it's similar to the Jack-Jack 8, I believe it was, but the difference here is, the first thing that jumps to my mind here, which I'm hoping you think too, so pause for a moment and think if you want, but it's very easy to check call on this board compared to the Jack-Jack 8. The Jack-Jack 8 was I don't really have any, if I want to check call nines, I don't want to get all these overcards, Whereas here, it's if I have ace-queen, I'm just check calling. So, important to notice that, on this board, I don't think you're going to need to check raise as aggressively when you're out of position because you can check call. Very easily you can check call. You can even check call some really, really strong nutted hands if you wanted to get tricky here to sort of balance out your queens. So yeah, check calling on this board is going to be a lot easier. The difference between multi-way and heads up is going to be, once again, sizing. Especially tricky here because you have a removal effect that's a big deal, but you probably can work out math to this spot and be like, okay, if I have trips, I want to make a sizing that gets my opponent to call down with some worse queens. Because honestly, if I have trips here and I make big bets, especially if I have weak trips, I'm only going to get called by better hands, then I'm going to make all the queens fold. That sucks. Whereas if you were heads up, you might be able to make decent-sized bets on all 3 sheets with king-9 suited because your opponent will call down with mostly queens because there's 3 queens in the deck and 1 king. Whereas if you're multi-way, making big bets with king-9 probably going to be a bad idea. Now, some people might say, well, doesn't that let your opponent see a turn card with a flush draw too cheaply? It might, so you have to take that into account and figure out what works best for your flop and turn sizing. but be aware of how much stronger multi-way ranges get compared to single raised heads-up pots. People usually underestimate the effect. Ranges get strong really, really quickly when you're multi-way. So you want to be careful here. If you're hoping to get a queen to call down, I mean, it's hard to get a queen to call down 3 streets even if you bet pretty small. And it's hard to get a queen to call down even 2 streets if you bet big. And in position, you're just going to do the same deal as usual, right? No big deal. 8-6-5, very similar to the other board texture, so I'll just skip it. Jack 3, very similar to the other board texture we talked about. Jack 8, two-tone, I believe. When you start doing this stuff, you see a lot of the similar boards appear, and that makes it really easy for kind of knowing what to do. We've already talked about the problems. Here, when we're multi-way, it's even easier. Don't bet queens, kings, or aces when you're multi-way here. There's too many people with too many jacks. You're going to check it, and you're going to just deal with facing bets. I don't think most people do that on this board here, multi-way, but the leak of, hey, if I bet the flop, my opponent can call with the worst, and maybe he'll fold and I'll never have to face a tough decision, that encourages people to, like, bet in spots they shouldn't be betting because they want to just avoid tough spots. Don't do that. I get check calling with queens here is tougher than betting it, because when you check call with queens, you're guaranteeing your opponent see a turn card, right? There's no way you cannot see a turn realistically. I mean, I guess one could bet the other raises and the other folds, but especially heads up, if you're check calling, you're guaranteeing your opponent sees a turn card, and that scares people because they have to make decisions. Don't let that scare you. Here, you're not getting value by betting aces, kings, or queens. Giving free cards isn't that big a deal. Check call those hands. With 10s or 9s, you might... Oh, that'd be tough, actually. 10s or 9s, I think you maybe can get away with betting like 10s and hope your opponent calls one sheet with 9s, 8s, or 7s. So maybe you could get away with betting 10s and check folding 9s, something like that. These two might actually be different enough here where you do a different line based on whether it's a pocket 10s or pocket 9s. So yeah, those are going to be a little bit trickier. And then the jacks, again, the removal effect's a big deal, but you can probably bet them sometimes and check them sometimes. You want to be able to defend some of your checks by check. Probably wouldn't be check raising, but you can defend some of your checks by check calling a strong hand. And then you also want to be betting some of your good hands, because if you never bet any of your good hands, it might set off alarm bells and your opponents just check back more than you'd like. Alright, likely the last board. Oh, so this is kind of a different one than one we've had before. So ace, king, 6 with 2 clubs. So, how easy is this board to defend by checking? You can imagine it multi-way like we've been talking about. You can imagine it heads up. Let's do heads up first. Heads up, how difficult is this board to defend by checking? Not hard at all. You can check call some weak aces. You can check call some queen X. It's probably about as easy as board textures come to check a call. Multi-way, it's probably going to be pretty similar, where it's not that hard to check a call here on this flop when you just have ace jack or ace 10. The hand strength you need to check call is going to be much different, because if you're multi-way, don't check call with queen jack. Whereas with heads up, that's probably good. Multi-way, you probably want like an ace or something to check call. Maybe even a decent ace. So that, I think, is kind of obvious here. There's nothing too different. You also are going to probably be able to check raise reasonably comfortably here. Like, you can still check raise like pocket 6s when you're out of position. Ace queen is what makes everything so tricky here, because people really like cold calling in position with ace queen. So ace queen kind of means that you're going to face a lot of flop raises on this board, so that might encourage you to bet a little bit smaller when you have a hand like ace king or ace jack. Again, this is heads up or multi-way. You're just going to get raised a lot on this board. One thing that's very interesting about this board texture is, if I was talking to someone and I said, like, what hands do you want to value raise, what hands do you want to bluff raise, something they'll often tell me here is they'll say, okay, so cutoff versus button. I'm the cutoff and I bet you're in the button. What hands do you value raise? They'll go, oh, ace queen and pocket 6s. And ace 6 suited if I can have it. And I go, okay. How many hand combos is that? 9 ace queen, 3 pocket 6s. So that's 12 hand combos. And if you were going to balance that out with bluffs and draws, you'd end up raising just this huge chunk of your range. So that's something that's just very, very important to take into account. When ranges aren't that wide and offsuit combos hit 2 pair, that is a big deal that will greatly impact bet sizing and bet frequency. So here, if our opponent can have a lot of ace queens, it's probably not unreasonable to think, alright, I should bet a little smaller when I'm value betting a hand like ace king here, so I lose less when I'm beat, so I lose less when I face a raise, because it just sucks when you bet ace king and you face a raise. but it's going to suck less if you put less money in the pot. Also, since your opponent's going to have to defend less hands, because remember, he can defend ace-queen and a whole bunch of air, you're further going to have to bet smaller, so you can get hands like ace-jack and ace-10 to call down. So, again, that would be heads-up or multi-way, but the ranges are just going to shift a little. You need stronger hands when you're going to be heads-up, and you're going to have to, maybe bet a little bit smaller if you're trying to get value if you're betting multi-way with a hand like ace-king, or even ace-queen, to be honest. Yeah, so this is a pretty interesting board texture. When you're in position here, and you're facing a bet, I know I'm kind of skipping over that stuff, but I really just feel like the people that are watching these videos probably got it for the most part. When you're in a position here, you can raise some, but not all, of your ace, queen, and sixes, raise some of your draws, raise the right types of bluff raises. So here, another problem with raising all your ace, queen, and pocket sixes is you probably don't have that many good bluff raise combos. So this is a board texture where if you're in position, let me actually just do the cutoff first button flat. Like, what kind of hands make good bluff raises here? Think about this for a moment, because this is a really big deal. And by the way, I think theoretical play is actually really, really useful for exploitative play, as I'm going to show kind of right here. Like, this is kind of why I think that. But here, you can see how, if someone's going to raise ace, queen, and pocket sixes here, I think most people would agree, cutoff first button, when a player's in position, people are going to usually raise ace, queen, or sixes when they have it on the flop. What kind of bluff randomizers do you have to balance out that many value raises? King Jack suited, which is 3 combos if you don't count the flush draw. King 10 suited, which is 3 combos. Jack 10 suited, which is 3 combos. So that gets us to 9, and those are pretty good bluffs, because a lot of those will have the backdoor or the runner flush draw too. So that's 9. Then after that we have 8-7 of hearts, 8-6 of whatever. So 8-6, 7-6, 8-7 of hearts, and 6, and then I guess like 5-4 of hearts. So you would have to bluff raise all of those hands and more to sort of be balancing out your raises with enough bluffs. So it's a board texture where, like, if someone's raising all of those strong hands here, all their ace, queen, and sixes, they're just not going to be able to have enough bluffs unless they're bluffing really, really bad randomizers. And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes you have to bluff a bad randomizer. And this one actually wasn't as bad as I had originally thought when I started talking about it, because you can bluff raise the 6, which helps a lot. Whoa, I just kicked my mouse. So you can bluff raise the 6, which helps a lot. Whereas if I made this, like, right here, then that would make my point even truer. Because now I'd say, well, on the flop you can bluff raise those 9 gut shots, but what else? There's like nothing. Like, you have to really go out of your way to bluff raise this board if you're raising all of your ace, queens, and pocket 2s here to remain balanced. So it's important to notice this kind of stuff, where even if you think, like, it shouldn't be like you're just analyzing board textures for theory, or, it should be both for theory and exploitative play when you're just trying to understand stuff better. But when you do this kind of stuff, don't just, like, think, like, okay, how can I balance out enough bluff raises here when I'm in position? Also think, your opponents probably aren't going to know this. So if you get raised on this board texture, and even if the 2 is a 6, if you get raised on this board texture, it's probably just going to be super weighted towards value. Because they have to be going really out of their way to be adding in, like, 9-8 of hearts, 8-7 of hearts, 7-6 of hearts, 6-5 of hearts on a board texture like this to get the bluffs. Alright, so that pretty much wraps it up. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's one of the more interesting and fun videos to make because I have to kind of do everything on the spot, but it's also a little tricky, so just, I'm sure I missaid something at a point or something's not clear, so just ask me it in the forums, and then hopefully you enjoy the video and learn some stuff. So good luck everyone, I'll see you later. Bye.